Welcome everybody who's joined us so far. This is Power Up, the first of our two sessions on electricity generation. I'm Lori Benson. I'm chair of the First-Plymouth Congregational Church Climate Action Team. This evening, we're honored to have Scott Benson, who sadly I am not related to give an overview of electricity generation in Nebraska, and especially for Lincoln Electric System, followed by Ken Winston, who is a Climate Action Team member, briefing us on threats to the involvement of the public in Nebraska's highly regarded public power utilities. Now, you may be wondering, why does a church group want to talk about electricity? It's this simple. If we care about God's people and planet, we have to understand and reconsider how we generate electricity. Scott Benson is the manager of resource and transmission planning at Lincoln Electric System, a position he's held since 2012. His area's primary responsibilities consist of planning for the utility's future generation resource needs, including acquiring and administering renewable energy power purchase agreements and planning transmission system upgrades and additions to serve those resources in the LES service area. Scott graduated from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 1993 with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, followed by a master's degree in electrical engineering from the same institution in 1996. Ken Winston is a man of many hats in the world of environmental advocacy. He's currently the executive director for Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light and a community organizer for the Nebraska Sierra Club. He represented the Sierra Club as a policy advocate before the legislature for 14 years. He led the Nebraska Sierra Club's successful opposition to the Keystone XL pipeline, both as an attorney and policy advocate, and has been part of the Beyond Coal campaign's efforts to increase investments in renewable energy and to retire coal plants. He's a parent of 3 adult children and grandparent of 1 absolutely adorable grandchild. He loves to play guitar, sing in the church choir, and go for walks with his dog, Jojo. Scott will be our first presenter for roughly 40 minutes, followed by Ken for roughly 10 minutes. I don't know if we'll have time for questions, but we may have time for a few. If everyone will hold their questions or put them in the chat, we will answer them if possible. So Scott, the floor or the Zoom screen is yours.
Thank you, Lori.
Oh, and one other thing, people, I think everybody's pretty much got their video and audio shut off, but that's maybe less distracting to our speakers. So thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much. Let's get this started here. Okay, can you see my screen, Lori?
Yes, looks good. Thank you.
All right, we'll get started then. Well, thanks for being here tonight, everybody. Like Lori said, we're going to talk a little bit about electricity generation in Nebraska. As most of you probably know, Nebraska is the only state in the United States that's 100% public power. And so we're going to start off tonight by just breaking down what is the value proposition that public power brings to you. The first leg of that stool, reliability. Some of the best reliability in the entire country. This is a portion of a brochure put out by the Nebraska Power Association in 2021. You can see there in 2018, U.S. News had the reliability of Nebraska #1 in the country. And in 2021, for the average customer, you had power less than a total of 1 hour over the entire year. So really high reliability. That's really important. Our customers count on it every day. What else do they count on? They count on affordability. And if you look at that chart there, you can see that Nebraska's got some of the lowest rates in the entire country, far below the US average. And then the other big leg of the stool, sustainability. You can see there a little bit how Nebraska's resource mix has changed in about 10 years there from 2010 to 2019, and it's just continued. A lot of growth in renewables, both on the utility side, and then you can see from that chart below it, in the incentives and programs we offer to allow our customers to install their own renewables and get integrated into the system. So if you take all that, reliability, affordability, and sustainability, that's where that value comes from. And boy, this should blow your mind. It did for me, and I've been in this industry a long time. In 2021, the average cost per customer per day in Nebraska, $3.55 for everything that electricity does for you. And if you think about it, it touches every minute of your life. You're always using something that burns or runs on electricity. To be able to do that for $3.55 per day, and that's not per person, that's per customer. So if you have a family, that's just one account. That's a really mind-boggling number. Says a lot to Nebraska Public Power. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about tonight, is what all goes in to making sure we have a reliable, affordable, and sustainable power, particularly from the generation standpoint. Now, when you talk about those things, you got to talk about, how do we actually handle load and generation? It used to be historically, we had a whole bunch of generation for utility, and most of that was operated to serve our load. Now, if we had excess generation that was pretty low cost compared to others, we might have some energy sales. And if we could buy excess generation from somebody else that maybe was lower cost than our higher price units, we might have some energy purchases. But for the most part, for each utility in Nebraska, your generation went towards serving your load. And LES, for example, was what was called a balancing area. We had to balance load and generation. So every second of every minute of every hour of every day forever, they were perfectly balanced, because there's no wide scale storage as of right now. So the generation always has to equal the load. That all changed for everybody in Nebraska a few years ago when LES, the Nebraska Public Power District, NPPD, and the Omaha Public Power District, OPPD, join the Southwest Power Pool. The area, if you're not familiar with the Southwest Power Pool, it's the regional electricity market that we all participate in. You can see it there in the middle of your screen. Runs from northern Texas up to the Canadian border. And with that, all of a sudden, the Southwest Power Pool, they became the one lone balancing area for their entire region. So now 100% of LES's generation, for example, is sold to the SPP market to serve their entire load. And 100% of our load energy to serve our customers is purchased from the SPP market. So if you look at it today, since SPP is the one and only balancing area, they're balancing generational load across their entire footprint. If you look at just LES, our generation load are often way out of sync. There's times we have a lot of generation on, very little load. Times we have a lot of load, very little generation on. It all goes towards controlling it for one entity, the Southwest Power Pool. So you look at that and you're like, wow, that's a big region. How do they actually do that? Well, it's pretty simplistic if you break it down. So the first thing they do is they stack up all of their generation from the lowest cost to the highest cost. And this is your actual variable operating cost, what it costs you to produce megawatts or power. And then they look at what the load is and they say, okay, for that much load, we need same amount of generation. So that sets what they call the market price. The market price in the Southwest Power Pool is the price to serve the next megawatt. So they stack up all the generation from lowest cost to highest cost, make sure they got enough generation on to meet the load in the lowest possible cost, and really important, maintain system reliability. That's their job, and they're doing it all the time. So you look at that and you say, okay, well, what if the sun comes out and it gets really hot, and we're in the July and August part of the summer, so everybody's air conditioner is ramping up and running really hard. Well, if you look, what's that mean? Well, it means the load goes up. And if the load goes up, the market price goes up, because now they're getting into higher priced generators. So the price to serve the next megawatt just went up. You say, well, all right, let's reset that. What if you have a whole bunch of low cost generation in the Southwest Power Pool? And what the Southwest Power Pool has in low cost generation is a lot of wind. They sit on the best wind resource really in the world across their footprint. So you had a lot of wind with no fuel costs, a lot of low cost generation. And then maybe not for this year, but what it's been the last few years prior is really low natural gas prices. So now if you have a whole bunch of low cost generation in the footprint, what it means is you can serve that same load in SPP, if you look at that generation stack, with much lower cost generation. So now the price to serve the next megawatt just went down. So that's kind of how SPP operates that market. Now, it's a little more complicated than that, but that gives you a good idea of how it works. So they've actually got thousands of pricing nodes spread across their entire footprint. And there's actually three components to those pricing nodes. The first is the one we talked about, the price of energy. Now, that's the price to serve that next megawatt, and it's the same across their entire footprint. That is the price that every generator that's operating gets paid, and that is the price that every load that's consuming energy has to pay. That's the same price across the entire footprint, but there's a couple of things that actually change that geographically. One is the cost of transmission system congestion. Those are bottlenecks on the transmission system, the wires running around connecting everything, that prohibit the most cost-effective or efficient flow of power. Then you also have the cost of transmission system losses, because if you pump all that power across all those wires, you're going to lose some, usually in the form of heat. So those create some geographic variances. Now, this is probably the kiss of death, but we're going to try showing you something real quick so you get an idea of what that really looks like in the SPP footprint. Hopefully that's visible to you now. This is every 5 minutes, the Southwest Power Pool updates this pricing map. Anybody can look at it. It's out on spp.org. You can look at it anytime you want. And you'll notice it's really close to our example. On the left-hand side, you've got prices for the generation that go from lowest cost to highest cost. And then you can see across the footprint what the price of their generation is. Now, this is always dangerous when I do this, because since they update it every 5 minutes, I can't prepare beforehand. So we just got to shoot from the hip when we get on here. But you can see in Nebraska right now, if you look at the LMP, that's the marginal price in Lincoln, the price for energy is $24 per megawatt hour. You go up to one of the hotter spots on the map, North Dakota, there, instead of $24 per megawatt hour, it's $59 per megawatt hour, almost 60 bucks. What's driving that? Mostly that's congestion on the transmission system. If we go down, looks like Kansas has got something going on, because there's a price right there of minus $11 per megawatt hour. That's really weird, because what that means is if you're a generator online right now, the market is charging you $11.50 per megawatt hour to generate electricity. They're sending you a price signal that we've got a problem on the system. We have too much generation. It's out of balance with our load. So I'm going to send you this price signal that tells you I'd like you to ramp down. What's even weirder is if you're a load right now in Western Kansas, if you've got your lights on, you're getting paid, the utility is $11.50 per megawatt hour for every megawatt hour of energy you consume. Again, just sending a price signal to say generation and loads out of balance. Can we bring that more in line? So that just gives you an idea of some of the stuff the SPP market is dealing with. Really complicated. Again, when you consider doing that every 5 minutes, moving generation up and down, starting and stopping generation across the entire footprint to make sure that they're cost effectively and, importantly, reliably serving the load. All right, you should be back to the PowerPoint now. The one thing to keep in mind is when they have these market prices across the SPP footprint, that is just the variable cost of energy, what it really costs to produce it. So fuel costs are in there. Any maintenance that is derived because you operated the unit, that's all in your variable cost. What's not in there? The capital or the initial construction costs that you put out to build the unit. You don't put that in the market price. And also fixed costs. Any of those costs that go into your unit that you have, irregardless of how much it runs. A lot of that would be like the staffing at your generating plants. So it's just designed to capture in the market the variable cost, the true cost of producing the energy. So if you're a utility, one of your considerations when you're looking at generation is, well, I know it's going to get offered in the market, and if it runs, that's going to bring in revenue that helps lower my costs. That's a good thing. But there's a lot more to it than that. You've also got to make sure that you can meet your requirements in the Southwest Power Pool for generation. And the big one revolves around what they call capacity, the actual megawatt rating or the megawatts you can count out of getting in the unit. Well, so there's two numbers there. The first is the nameplate capacity. Nameplate capacity is what that unit is capable of producing at its full output. That's what it's rated to be able to do. All right. The other, and the really important one, is what they call accredited capacity. That's the amount that you can have to count on at the time of your peak load. Peak load for folks in Nebraska, a lot of times, is late afternoon, early evening in July and August when the air conditioners are really cranking up, but the industry is still online. Now, the Southwest Power Pool, they say you have to have enough accredited capacity, the capacity you can count on at the time of your peak, to meet your peak load plus an extra 15%. The idea is if everybody has an extra 15%, when there's outages on the system, or like what happened a couple years ago during Winter Storm Uri, hopefully that almost never happens because everybody's got a little bit extra to cover problems. Now for dispatchable resources, what I mean by dispatchable, those are things that you're in control of. It's kind of like your car with the foot feet. You can make that thing start, stop, go faster, slow down. That would be things like natural gas, nuclear, coal, hydro. That's dispatchable resources. For those resources, your accredited capacity, pretty close to your nameplate capacity. As long as you maintain the unit, and most importantly, you prove periodically that it can actually produce that value for 4 straight hours, that's what you can count. Non-dispatchable resources, things that you're not in control of. And why aren't you in control? A lot of times it's because Mother Nature's in control, which is things like wind and solar, or maybe it's battery storage. You're in control of it, but only for a limited duration. Well, those non-dispatchable resources, they have a different methodology they undergo, and that actually is changing in the Southwest Power Pool. We have a brand new methodology that starts next summer of 2023. And that is the effective load carrying capability. Now, we can only surface skim on this. This is a pretty complex topic. During LES's latest integrated resource plan last year, where we kind of plan out what our resource mix will look like in the future and make an action plan for the next 5 years, we did a workshop on this effective load carrying capability, or ELCC methodology, and it lasted a full 90 minutes just on this topic. So we're really going to surface skim it tonight. But in the end, ELCC, or effective load carrying capability, that's the incremental amount of load you can serve because you've added a certain resource type. So how much more load can the Southwest Power Pool serve because they've added all of their wind or all of their solar in a vacuum? Now, because things like wind and solar are intermittent, inherently the way this works is the more of that same resource you add, the less you get to account as accredited capacity. Now, why is that? That always seems weird to people. So look at the chart I've got on there. I've got 3 lines. The blue shows energy storage, like 4-hour battery storage. The yellow is solar, and the green is wind. Now, across the horizontal bottom axis, the x-axis, that's the amount of megawatts of that generation in the footprint, okay? Projections going forward. On the vertical axis on your left, that's the percent of the nameplate that you get to count as accredited capacity. That's what the ELCC stands for. I want to draw your attention to the yellow line. That's solar. You can see that if you're the first person to put in solar, gosh, you could count like 80%. So if you build 100 megawatts in nameplate, SPP is going to give you credit for 80 megawatts of accredited capacity, that capacity you need to serve your peak load plus 15%. But as more and more people add solar to the footprint, you're not going to get 80% anymore. Your number is going to go down. And it just goes down over time until finally at about 40,000 megawatts, you're down below 20%. So you're building 100 megawatts of solar, same 100 megawatts you built before, but maybe you're only getting just less than 20 megawatts of credit. So why does that go down over time? A great example is solar in California. The first person to ever build solar in California years ago, they were a genius. California said, this is great. Our peak load, our time of greatest need is when the sun is up. It's really hot. Your solar is putting out its max at that point. Marriage made in heaven. But now what's happened? California has so much solar that their greatest time of need from a reliability standpoint is no longer when the sun's up. It's right after the sun goes down and all their solar shuts off. So if you go to California now and you say, hey, good news, I'm going to build you some new solar. What they're going to say is, well, that's great, but we don't really need the solar at the time you're giving it to us because we have so much already. That's why that number tends to trend down over time as you add more of the same resource. This is a huge consideration going forward because remember, the Southwest Power Pool is going to require you to have enough generation capacity to meet your peak load plus 15%. You got to factor in that when you're doing things like wind, solar, and battery storage, you're going to get a partial percentage, and that partial percentage is going to go down over time. Doesn't mean you shouldn't add them. It means you got to understand those rules to make sure that you're setting up an effective, efficient portfolio. So I'm going to show you right now what Nebraska's resource portfolio looks like. Now, this is from the Nebraska Power Association again. Every year, they put out what's called a load and capability report. They look at their load, they look at their generating capability, and they make sure Nebraska in aggregate has enough to serve its customers. This is also from out on their website. You can go out and look at this every year when it's updated. I'm going to apologize right up front. there's a lot to unpack in these load and capability report charts, but if we walk through it, I know you can handle it. It's not too bad. So what this one shows you is the state's generation and load in the summer season, which is typically when we're hitting our peak. So the red shaded area, that's the amount of accredited capacity that Nebraska has, okay? The capacity SPP's given us credit for. The blue shaded area, that is Nebraska's peak load plus an extra 12%. I know some of you are sharp. You're saying, all of you are sharp. Let me give you the benefit of the doubt. And what you're saying right now is, you know what? I know Scott earlier told me that margin was 15%, and now he just said 12. Well, that's because earlier this year, SPP switched that margin from 12% to 15%. This report was completed when it was 12%. But you just add a little bit to the blue shaded area, and you're in the same ballpark. What you can see is that, hey, we've got more accredited generation for the next 20 years than we do load. That's a good thing. Now, if you look at the bottom of the chart, and we're using the right-hand axis now, there's a red line goes all the way straight across. That is SPP's requirement for that extra buffer, that reserve margin. The line's at 12%, but in your mind's eye, move it up just a little bit to 15%. The lime green line, that is Nebraska's actual reserve margin. When you compare our generation to our load, what percent of buffer do we have? And you can see that Nebraska is well above even what would be a 15% line until we're just tickling it out in 2041. So with all of our committed resources that we have today, you can see that we've got enough generation to cover our load in the state for probably the next 2 decades. Now, this is the same chart, but it's in the winter. Scale's a little different, but you can see the same thing. Again, the shaded red, that's our accredited winter generation. The shaded blue, that's our winter load projected over the next 20 years in aggregate for all of Nebraska, all the utilities in Nebraska. Got quite a bit of margin there. Again, the red line, that's at 12%, but you should bump it up in your mind's eye to 15%. And you can see that in the winter, boy, we're really good. Even after 2 decades, we're well above that 15% in the mid-20s. So a lot of extra room in the winter. Why is that? Well, primarily the loads around here are typically lower in the winter than they are in the summer. Now, this one's definitely the most difficult, so bear with me, hang in there. What this is showing you is what the MPA report calls the greenhouse gas mitigating resources. Basically, it's all the non-CO2 emitting resources. So we've got 5-year increments there over most of the next 2 decades. And we actually look back to 2017 to give you a look in the rearview mirror. And if you notice, there's 2 columns for every one of those 5-year periods. The first column, the leftmost one, that's the nameplate generation, what you actually built. The one to the right of it, that's the accredited generation, what the Southwest Power Pool is going to give you credit towards meeting your peak load plus that extra 15%. Now, if you look at those, you can see the purple, that's nuclear. The 2 colors of blue, different kinds of hydro, both in-state hydro and then out-of-state, which is typically under a federal agency, the Western Area Power Administration. That's a series of dams to the north of us. The pink is wind, and then you've got biogas or biofuels and landfill right above it with green, that's a little sliver, and then you see solar, all right? So if you look at the pink in 2017, that's a great example. Look at the difference in wind between nameplate generation on the left and accredited generation on the right. Huge difference, right? But you can see how that kind of trends going forward over most of the next 20 years. Now, if you look at the black line towards the bottom and the right-hand axis, that's the percentage of nameplate of those non-CO2 emitting resources compared to the entire portfolio across Nebraska. And you can see pretty healthy number. Starts off in the upper or mid to upper 30s, and I think it hits its peak in 2027 is projected to be into the mid 40 percentiles. And that's all given plans for today. I would wager a good amount that that number will be higher as you get into the future. It's just this is everybody's best guess as to what they know they're going to be building today. This isn't based on what people think might happen. This is stuff that's pretty certain that people are counting on putting in. And then the last thing from that load and capability report, they also have a section where they talk about the different decarbonization goals across the state. This is where you bring in more of that sustainability. So there's 4 of them they report on in there. The first one, Lincoln Electric System. Lincoln Electric System is looking to have net zero CO2 production from our entire generation portfolio by the year 2040. For those of you who don't know, net zero means we don't have to get all the way to zero. We don't have to eliminate all the CO2 emissions. We just got to get close enough that we can offset the remainder. Maybe we're going to plant trees, and that's going to consume enough CO2 that'll offset the few emissions that we do have to make sure we're reliably serving our system. Then you have the Municipal Energy Agency of Nebraska, or MEAN. You have the Nebraska Public Power District, or MPPD, and the Omaha Public Power District of OPPD. They're all looking to be net zero or carbon neutral, different ways to basically say the same thing, by 2050. So that's all the goals that have currently been announced in the state of Nebraska. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to dive into the one that I can actually speak to in detail, and that's the one for LES. So we already talked about LES's goal, net zero CO2 production by the year 2040. But there's a few things that our LES administrative board, who adopted the goal, included in the board resolution that would kind of border the path and the pace to which we achieve this goal. They said, you know what, we're going to make sure we maintain high reliability because our customers count on it every day. We're also going to try and maintain as best we can our low rates because our customers also count on that every day, especially the ones on low and fixed incomes. And then finally, we're going to maintain high levels of environmental stewardship. And every time I talk about that, people say, well, that seems kind of weird. Why are you talking about environmental stewardship as part of a CO2 goal? Obviously, you're doing environmental stewardship. Well, what it really means is we're not going to chase reductions in CO2 at the expense of making other environmental problems. And we're not going to put in a bunch of generation if we don't think there's a way to properly recycle it, let's say, when it is finally decommissioned. So those are the other considerations. We also got to make sure that we honor our existing contracts. You've got contracts for this generation that typically last for decades. You got to work through some things with those. And then finally, we're going to need technology to come along and help us out because a lot of the things we need from a generation standpoint simply don't exist today, at least commercially, where you can really go out and buy them. So we're going to need some advancements in that area. Things in the nuclear side, we're going to need advancements in battery storage. It'd be great if someday we could do carbon capture and sequestration. All those things that are getting worked on, we really need better versions, sometimes just any version in the future. Give you a little bit of backdrop before we talk about how LES is going to try to achieve that goal, at least in the near term. This is LES's resource portfolio. You can see we have coal across 3 states. We're a minority owner of a coal resource in Wyoming and another one in Iowa, and we're a minority participant in a coal resource in Nebraska. We get hydro from that Western Area Power Administration, that federal agency that has a series of dams to the north of us. We have 3 local natural gas facilities. We've got a bunch of wind across 3 states. It's actually spread evenly, 100 megawatts in Oklahoma, 100 megawatts in Kansas, and about 100 megawatts aggregate, just over 100 in Nebraska. We have a landfill gas project that makes electricity from methane that's produced naturally from the Lincoln landfill all year round. And then we have our community solar project. It's about 5 megawatts DC, the first utility scale solar project that was ever put in the state of Nebraska in the year 2016. That's our resource portfolio today. On the right-hand side, what you see is LES's CO2 rate for that generating portfolio dating back to 2010. And you can see this chart goes from 2010 through the last completed year, 2021. Now that bounces around a lot, that CO2 production. Why is that? Because the Southwest Power Pool, they're actually dispatching our generation to meet the needs of the entire footprint. Some years they run less, some years they run more. A lot depends on fuel prices like natural gas, how much wind is happening in the market, those kinds of things. So it bounces around, but if you look at it and kind of draw a trend, you can see that we've had a really steep decline there over just about a decade's worth of time. But you also, if you continue looking at that, you can see we got a long ways to go because that gray dashed line, that's that decarbonization goal, trying to get to net zero by 2040. I mentioned it earlier, LES just completed our latest integrated resource plan where we try to look a long ways out in the future, see what our generation mix should look like to be best served for our customer owners. Well, one of the big things we did out of this year's integrated resource plan is we looked at our new decarbonization goal and broke down how do we think we're going to achieve that, at least today. So I'm going to take you through last thing here is how we think we're going to attack that. So what you've got here is a chart that shows if you take all of LES's existing generation that's going to be here in 2041, that's 1 year, so right after the decarbonization goal takes place, and you stack all that up as a credited generation, not the nameplate. This is what SPP is going to give us credit for in 2041 towards meeting our peak load plus an extra 15%. And you're comparing it to the red line at the top because that's projected to be our peak load plus 15% in 2041. And if you add all that up, you can see we just make it. What you've got there is you have coal at the bottom in the black, then you have natural gas in the light blue, hydro in the dark blue. The little orange sliver, that's our landfill gas. And the top is our sustainable energy program. For those of you who don't know, that is LES's collection of energy efficiency and demand reduction programs where we incentivize our customers to partner with us to use less of our energy, especially across the time of the peak, which is the 1 hour every year that we build the entire system to serve because everybody doesn't want their lights to go out just because we hit a peak load day in late afternoon, early evening in July. So we're pretty good. One of the things you'll notice, hey, you just showed us you have a lot of wind, but there's no wind on there. Well, that's right, because all that wind is under contract. And per the letter of the contract, those contracts are scheduled to expire by the time we get to 2041. Doesn't mean you couldn't extend them, maybe negotiate an extension, but we're just, with this exercise, just going by what's in the contract, and their 20 and 25-year lives will be over by 2041. So if you look at that, you'd say, wow, we got just enough generation to meet our peak load requirement. So now we're going to talk about how does that generation stack have to change to meet our decarbonization goal. One of the things we looked at in the integrated resource plan is that we're going to have to look for the right time to either retire or mitigate our coal resources. When I say mitigate, what am I talking about? Primarily looking to add carbon capture and sequestration. Capture most of that CO2 so it doesn't go out the stack, it gets placed in storage, probably underground. That's what a lot of people in the industry are working on. What we found from the IRP is if you hang on to these coal resources too long, you wait to retire them well past the point you should have, financially, they'll pull you down. They become kind of a boat anchor because they're not able to financially compete in the electricity market. At the flip side, if you retire them too early, they do the exact same thing. Financially, they're a burden that pulls you down. And that's because you're going to have to build something new to replace them. That's a lot of money because generation is expensive. And what you built to replace them probably isn't performing as well as the coal resource you just got rid of because you got rid of it too early because it was still performing well in the market. Timing is going to be everything with these coal resources. We're going to have to be smart enough to note the time to either retire them or try to add carbon capture and sequestration. And most importantly, brave enough to take the step because both of those are going to be scary. They're really big steps forward. We're also going to try to maintain our existing natural gas fleet. People look at that and they say, well, how can you do that under this decarbonization goal if you're going to be net zero by 2040? Well, if you look at LES's natural gas fleet over the last 5 years, its average operations was 5% of what it's totally capable of. So if you said all those natural gas resources are on all year at full output, they ran at 5% of that. If you look at the CO2 emissions, those same natural gas resources in aggregate, they produced 5% of LES's total CO2 emissions. When the LES Administrative Board gave LES a goal of net zero by CO2 by 2040, the net zero targeting things like these natural gas resources. They're really important. They maintain system reliability. They help us maintain our low costs, and they almost never run. And that's not a problem because they were designed to never run. They're only there to come on at peak periods. We're also going to have our existing hydro contract. That's not really a decision point because that contract extends through 2050. We're also planning on having our landfill gas assets. We own those. So we expect those to also, they're not very big, but we expect those to be here and helping once we get out to 2041 as well. And then finally, we're planning to continue that sustainable energy program, that collection of energy efficiency and demand reduction resources where we partner with and incentivize our customers, most of you, to use less of our product, most importantly across our peak times, because if you use less across our peak, that means our peak demand goes down, which means that's less generation we got to add, and that generation, again, very expensive. So we can minimize that. That's good for everybody. So we're going to look to continue that and grow it where we can. Now, all of that is existing. That's all existing resources. And you can see that took us a long ways but we're a long ways from that red line still, right? So we got to do some new stuff. First thing we're going to do is we're going to maintain LES's allotment of tier 1 wind. Remember, that's that highest priority that you put in. And I can't even say remember because I forgot to explain this to you when we were on that chart. I just realized that. But I can do it now. When we talked about the accredited generation that you get for wind, solar, and battery storage, we have those lines that go down the more that's added to the footprint. Well, what SPP does is they prioritize that. So they say for your first bit of, in this example, wind, we'll let you count more of that. You can count a higher percentage. But once you get so much wind, we're going to put you in tier 2 and tier 3, which lets you count a remarkably lower percentage. So LES right now, we're one of the few entities in all of SPP, there's only a handful of us, that actually has more wind than our tier 1 limit. We're into tier 2. Going forward, even though all of our existing wind is scheduled to retire because the contracts will be up, we're going to backfill that with new wind and try to maintain that tier 1 level. So there you can see that. We're also going to look to develop LES's allotment of tier 1 solar, the highest priority solar that gives you the highest percentage of nameplate to count as accredited capacity. Now, right now we have a very small solar resource in the grand scheme of things, about 4 to 5 megawatts. But if you look forward, what we're looking at here is about 170 megawatts. So stark difference. And we're going to try and have that by the time we get to the end of that 2040 period. In fact, one of the big action items coming out of the LES IRP, Integrated Resource Plan, was that we're going to try and add a local solar resource in the near term. And we think we want to own and operate it. We might try to contract with other developers for it, similar to what we have done in the past with things like wind and solar, but this time we think we'd like to own it and run it ourselves. So we're going to be working on that over the next 5 years. Probably going to take more than 5 years maybe to get it built, but we want to get a long ways down the road. So you add all that up and what you find out is we're about 200 megawatts short of that red line. And you know what we said for right now? That's a good plan. We're going to stop there. I don't know what that 200 megawatts is going to be, but I think it's more prudent now to leave it blank than to try and fill it in. Why is that? Because we got almost 2 decades. We do an integrated resource plan every 5 years. And honestly, even though we only do an integrated resource plan every 5 years, we're doing that kind of resource planning every single day. We've got a lot of time for our crystal ball to get clearer to help us figure out what are the technologies that would be best suited to serve our customers and fill that final 200 megawatt niche. It could be nuclear. It could be something like coal or natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. Most undoubtedly, I would think a portion is going to be battery storage of some type. Probably better batteries than what we have today, but battery storage nonetheless. It could be stuff we haven't even talked about. There's a lot of people who are looking at running natural gas resources, but not on natural gas. They're going to run them on hydrogen, or they're going to run them on ammonia, or they're going to run them on carbon neutral natural gas substitutes. All those different things hopefully are going to come to fruition in the next 2 decades so we can capitalize and fill in the last 200 megawatt gap. But right now, that's our goal. And you can see we've got our marching orders and we can get most of the way there. And then in the coming years, we'll fill in the rest. I think I'm right about my time. That's all I've got for you. Thank you very much. Hang on the line here because I know Ken's talk is going to be very interesting. And then if we got any time for Q&A afterwards, we'll open it up. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Scott. That was really an excellent presentation. Of course, I've seen parts of that presentation before, and I really think that well, Scott always does a great job. So he's a tough act to follow. Well, I'm coming to you live from Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and so hopefully the signal's good. I'm going to be talking about legislative threats to public power and other related issues. Well, first of all, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the threats to public institutions in general. There's been attacks on public schools, attacks on the University of Nebraska, attacks on state and local government, and there's also been attacks on public power. And most of these attacks are based upon false narratives. Now, if you think about the attacks on public schools, there's a couple of things that people usually bring up who are attacking public schools. One of them is critical race theory, and it's a false narrative. I mean, critical race theory is not really, it's not being taught in public schools. It's only being taught in graduate school and in a few graduate schools and college courses. So it's a very rare subject. But in any event, people make a lot of mileage out of it for political purposes and use that narrative to attack the public schools. Well, similarly, there's false narratives that are being used to attack public power. And one of the narratives that's been used is the idea that the boards, well, in public power, we have boards that we can go and talk to. There are people, I see at least one person who is a member of the Lincoln Electric System board. Carl Estridge is on the LES board, who's participating tonight. And I know Karen Griffin's also a member of First-Plymouth, and she's also on the LES board, and Kim Morrow. So these are people that we know and who represent us on the LES board. And so the idea is that the false narratives is that public power has been taken over by radicals who are pursuing an agenda of having all kinds of renewable energy, and they're not taking into account the need for reliability or any of those kinds of things. And so, and one of the narratives that they like to use, they like to talk about the February 2021 blackouts. And I don't know if you remember that, but it was really cold in February of 2021. And there were blackouts, and the cold went all the way down to Texas. And as a result, of course, folks in Texas had a really bad problem. Some people lost power for a week or longer. And that's a long story. We could talk about all the reasons why that happened. But in Nebraska, we had to deal with, in LES territory, I think we faced like 45 minutes of being without power. And of course, anytime you're without power, it's an inconvenience, but nobody was without power for an extended period of time. So anyway, they like to use this kind of narrative. But in fact, as Scott pointed out, Nebraska's public utilities are among the most reliable in the country. And in particular, LES, I think the average outage in the country is about 2 hours. And LES's average outage is 17 minutes, which is one of the best in the country. And they also, as Scott was talking about, you notice how he talked about reliability. I mean, reliability and cost were factors that the board considers and the staff considers anytime they're considering a generation resource. So the narrative is completely false. And also, as Scott was indicating, they went through an integrated resource plan, and it was really well done. Scott led most of it, but there was lots of great explanations about the various resources that were being considered. But every time they considered a resource, they considered the cost and the reliability of that resource. And so it wasn't, they didn't just willy-nilly throw out resources and say, oh, we're going to use this to reduce our carbon emissions. Now, the goal is, as Scott pointed out, they're planning to meet their goal of 100% carbon-free or net zero carbon by 2040, and I think they've got a good plan that they've laid out. Now, the response has been by some state senators who are using these false narratives, and of course, there's a couple of state senators who just hate renewable energy. In particular, they don't like wind energy. And so particularly State Senator Bostelman and State Senator Brewer. So they introduced a couple of, and I think they would agree. I think they would say that, well, I don't know if they would say they hate it, but they would say that they're opposed to wind energy, and they'd have a lot of reasons why they're opposed to it. But they also oppose solar energy and any kind of renewables. So they introduced several bills. Senator Bostelman introduced LB 1045, LB 1046, and LB 1047, and Senator Brewer introduced LB 1058. Now, these senators have also introduced other bills that have been problematic for renewable energy, but these were particularly focused on public power. Now, LB 1046 was a particularly bad bill. That bill would have given the governor the authority to appoint the majority of the members of the OPBD, Omaha Public Power District, and Nebraska Public Power District boards, and also to appoint their CEOs. LB 1047 would have put reliability requirements Now that sounds like a great thing. Oh yeah, we need to make sure that we're reliable. But the requirements would have been so redundant, it would have caused people's electric rates to double practically. And then LB 1058 would have made it extremely expensive to retire any fossil fuel units, any coal-fired power plants, by requiring a payment of $50 million to the county in which it's located, requiring to pay the salaries of all employees for 5 years afterwards. Now, there was strong, nearly unanimous opposition to all three of these bills. So imagine the surprise of the people who were opposed to them when the provisions of LB 1058, that, remember, that's the bill that would create impediments, cost impediments to retiring fossil fuel units. That those provisions were put into another bill, LB 1045, and that bill was advanced to the floor of the legislature. That's nearly unheard of, to have a bill that was unanimously or nearly unanimously opposed, where there's really strong opposition. Nobody but the introducer came in support of it, to have that bill be advanced to the floor of the legislature. Now, once it got to the floor of the legislature, it was also made a committee priority bill too. So after it was advanced to the floor of the legislature, there was never a vote taken on. So we don't know whether it would have gotten any further, but still, that's an unprecedented action. So what are the concerns going forward? Well, we're concerned about bills like this being introduced in the 2023 legislature. The problem is there is an interim study on public power, but they're not planning to have any hearings. So we don't know what they're planning to do. That's LR 355. And we're also concerned about, well, there's also some other bad bills. There's maybe some bills to prevent the use of conservation easements, which is another story completely. Now, there may be some positive legislation. There's some discussion about some bills that would increase the amount of the caps on net metering. That would be a positive. But but what can you do? Well, here's the things that I would suggest. There's organizations. Now, I work for the Nebraska Sierra Club and also for Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light. Both those organizations regularly monitor legislation and send out alerts. So follow what these organizations have to say. And if they do send out an alert, then what can you do? Well, you can, first of all, contact the committee and contact particularly the committee chairperson, but it's and you send testimony to the committee. You can testify at the public hearing on the bill. All legislation has a public hearing. And third is to contact your senator. And then the final thing that I'd like to mention is one of the things that Lori mentioned at the start of the evening, which is there's an election coming up on Tuesday. Find out what senators or what people who are running for the office are, what their positions are on things like renewable energy, and support those people. I mean, I realize it's a very short period of time, but maybe they could need some help with phone banking or handing out leaflets or what have you. And as somebody put in the chat, definitely go vote and vote for people who stand for the things that we care about. So thanks for the opportunity to present. And if we have time for questions, I'd be glad to respond.
Oh, very good. Thank you so much, Ken and Scott, both. Before we go to some questions, I just want to follow up on something that Ken mentioned that I was going to say in my closing remarks, but he's given me such a good segue that, of course, I have to take it. So in early January, the Climate Action Team is going to offer a how-to session on advocacy for we ordinary citizens. So we'll include things like how to contact an elected or appointed official and maybe what you say or don't say, how to write a letter to the editor or a guest column and get it published. And this is extremely important, how to talk to friends and family about these kinds of issues, whether it's, public utilities or climate change or any other issue that you care about. We just want citizens to be more comfortable being more active and involved. So you can watch for details on that starting in December, tentatively looking at dates of either January 3rd or 5th, probably Zoom, this same time slot of 7 to 8. So you can watch for that. So thank you. So Melissa Landis, who's part of our Climate Action Team, has been keeping an eye on the chat. And I think there are a couple of questions in there. So Melissa, or yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Lots of compliments to the speakers. Thanks so much for doing that. Had one question in the chat that asks, why is Nebraska still using coal? And I think that's for you, Scott.
Yeah, that's probably for me. Although I bet Ken would offer up a good answer. You know, when you look at it, we talked about the considerations for us, obviously sustainability. A lot of the big entities, all the big utilities in Nebraska have decarbonization goals. So sustainability is important, but there's also reliability and affordability. And our coal resources, the existing resources, fill a large niche when it comes to reliability and affordability. When we had Winter Storm Uri, Nebraska was actually a net exporter. So even though there were rolling outages across the Southwest Power Pool, that's only because we're all in this together. Nebraska was doing more than its fair share to try to prevent that. And a large portion of that was the coal resources, because the things that were struggling across some of the footprint were that the wind wasn't blowing, which is always bad in the Southwest Power Pool. And then some of the natural gas had issues. The coal resources came through really well. So they fill an important niche. Now, that's going to have to change going forward. Again, either they're going to have to be retired or we're going to have to find a way to mitigate those CO2 emissions. But currently today, they're still an important part of our portfolio. They really kind of are the bedrock that reliability is built on, as well as making sure we have affordable electricity for our customers.
Thanks. Looks like there's another one probably on the SPP map. Question came in, LES wind is in Oklahoma and Kansas plus Nebraska. And I think it was Carl that was asking, is LES getting paid for wind power that we're using?
Absolutely. Anybody that's been outside today or yesterday knows the wind has really been howling, right? And so those wind generators are twirling around for us. And anytime they're doing that, they're bringing in some revenue. The catch is, just like anything else in life, hey, if I'm making this much revenue, I'm hoping that my associated costs are below that. Sometimes with the wind, it can go the other direction. And why is that? That's because when the wind's really blowing for LES, you know what? That means it's really blowing for almost everybody else, because we got wind spread across the entire SPP footprint almost. And when there's really high wind, that means the price for electricity is really low. That's good if you're the load and you're paying that price. But remember, for your generator, you're getting paid that price. So it's kind of weird when there's a lot of wind, you're actually recouping the least amount of cost. When the costs in the market are the highest, that's when the wind's not blowing. So it kind of works that way out. But yeah, tonight, when I looked at that map, we're doing pretty good tonight from a revenue standpoint from the wind.
On the same topic of wind, Gene asks, it's his understanding that there's a backlog in SPP of bringing new solar and wind power resources online. Does this delay impact LES's ability to bring renewable energy generation online?
Absolutely. Good question, Gene. Impacts LES and everybody else in the Southwest Power Pool. So in a nutshell, anybody can hook up generators in the Southwest Power Pool. SPP says we'll hook you up any place, anywhere, anytime. But you got to pay for all the upgrades we have to make to the transmission system to make sure we can effectively and reliably flow that power. That doesn't sound like that big a deal, but there's so many people looking to add primarily wind in the SPP footprint. And again, why is that? Well, it's because it's the best wind area in the entire world. There's so many people looking to add wind that they can't keep up. And so currently they are about 4 years behind on doing the studies, the engineering it takes to tell you what your upgrade costs are going to be. So it makes it really difficult to put in new generation, because you can't really go and build it until you know what SPP is going to charge you to hook up to the system. Sometimes those can be really high costs. They might change your decision on the resource mix. So that is definitely something that LES, like everybody else in SPP today, that's a hurdle we got to cross. SPP's got a lot of plans in place to try to get that 4 years shrunk down, and they're making some progress, but that's going to be a difficult thing going forward, especially when we're looking at adding a large solar project. The good news for us, we're just in the planning phases. So we're not actually actively trying to hook anything up. What we're hoping is by the time we come out of planning and we're looking to start moving towards doing something, that the Southwest Power Pool's 4 year delay is much, much shorter. That's our plan. We don't really control it, but we're hoping.
Great. Looks like Penny drills down into some questions about renewables. She asks first, is hydro vulnerable to the increasing regional drought that's coming with the warming climate?
Oh, absolutely. That's something back in the 2011, 12, 13 timeframe. That was a little bit more of a difficult time for hydro because of drought conditions. And now LES's contract with the Western Area Power Administration, or WAPA, again, that federal agency, that's like what we call a generation certain contract. So they give us hydro, and if they can't supply the hydro because of drought, they actually have to procure that energy somewhere else and supply it to us. It wouldn't be hydro anymore, but at least you're getting the energy that they were promised. But that's a difficult thing. A lot of the resources we have not only have a primary water supply, but they usually have a secondary water supply, different wells and stuff, in addition to a reservoir to make sure they can handle it. So far, everything's been pretty good, but that is definitely something that all the hydro resources are watching very closely going forward.
Looks like the next question is about battery storage, and why is battery stored energy considered non-dispatchable?
Yeah, good question, Penny. That's a little bit confusing because with the battery, you do control when you can discharge that and when you get that energy. The reason the Southwest Power Pool considers it non-dispatchable is because it's over a very limited duration. So yeah, you might have a battery and you can decide when to discharge it, but at least currently, you only get about 4 hours. People always ask why, well, then just make something that's bigger than 4 hours. Well, most all the battery storage technology today is lithium ion. The same battery is used in your cell phone, or if you have an EV, your car. If you use lithium ion batteries for large scale utility level storage, the rule of thumb is anytime you double the duration, you double the cost. So to go from 4 hours to 8 hours is a huge cost. All of a sudden, it prices it out of the market. That's why everything's mostly 4 hours today. But lithium ion stuff's getting cheaper every day, mostly because all the batteries are making for EVs. And there's a lot of work on new technologies that are hoping to supplant lithium ion going forward. There is no doubt battery storage is going to be a bigger piece in the future. And as that duration gets longer, that percentage of nameplate that the Southwest Power Pool lets you count as accredited capacity, that gets much larger as well. So you start getting longer duration batteries, and a lot of this kind of takes care of itself. You get to count more of them.
And last question from Penny was, will customer net metering impact which tier we will be in for wind or solar, making the load worth less for LES?
So not currently. Currently, the way it works is when you look at utility scale, the really big stuff, that's what goes into our tier buckets for SPP. The stuff that our customers are putting behind the meter, kind of on the roof of their own home or their own business, that's a separate entity. So we get to kind of keep those separate. I don't know that's going to be that way forever, but that's how it currently is in the Southwest Power Pool.
Okay, I think that's the questions that we had, and I see our time is just about up. So I want to take a moderator's privilege though, and just ask Scott, I know you monitor the great new ideas that might be coming along to store or generate electricity. So very quickly, what's something that you've seen that you thought, wow, that's interesting, or who would have thought of that, or we could use that?
You know, so I'm gonna tip my hand just a little bit, okay? LES is actually working on a contract right now for a battery storage project. It's a pilot level project. Still gonna be pretty big compared to what's in Nebraska currently, but not so big that it's a huge financial burden to us because battery storage right now is not really a money maker. We're working on that. It's going to be in the middle of downtown Lincoln is the plan, because LES has a microgrid down there that can maintain critical city, county, state, and federal infrastructure in case we have a widespread disaster, probably weather related. That is a really neat thing. I can't talk more about it right now, but when I can, I would guarantee you're going to say, wow, Scott was right. That's a really neat thing. So that's my neat one. It's something we saw, something we pursued, and something that hopefully soon we'll be able to talk about.
Very interesting. We'll watch for that. And I kind of like the idea that LES has got a top secret project. So Well, I'll just point out that this evening's program has been recorded, as you're all aware, and this presentation should be posted to the Climate Action Team webpage probably within the next couple of days. So it'd be the same place that you saw the Zoom link to get on tonight. Please join us again next Thursday at 7 p.m. for part 2 of Power Up. Our noted UNL solar expert, John Hay, will tell us everything we need to know about adding solar to a house or a small building. And then Mark Skolnick with LES will describe financial incentives for solar and how to find a reputable contractor. So again, thank you so much to this evening's 2 presenters, Scott and Ken, for very, very interesting presentations. And thanks to our audience, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody back next week. Thank you.